In this tutorial, I'll show you how to do custom validation with Zod. I'll show you how to validate a Mongo Object Id in a post request and how to do async validation with Zod to check if a reference record exists. One of the common use cases I have is validating requests coming into an Express.js API. Recently, I tried validating a Mongo Object Id in a payload, and this turned out to be more difficult and nuanced than it should have been. When it comes to validating Mongo Object IDs, there's two things you'll want to do. First, you need to validate that the Object ID in your REST payload is a valid Object ID. In other words, it must conform to the Object ID specification. And secondly, if you're storing a Mongo ID in your collection, it probably means that it's used as a reference, and therefore, you'll need to check that the Object ID exists in the corresponding collection. So let's look at the first use case of simply validating whether an Object ID is a valid Object ID. I've got a node project that uses Express, TypeScript, and Mongoose with Zod. In my Mongoose schema for my to-do collection, I've got a title field which is a string, a category ID field which is an Object ID that is used as a reference, and two other fields. In my post route for to-dos, I've got this create-to-do function where I receive a create-to-do payload that only expects title and category ID properties. Back in my create-to-do function, this is where I call the validate create-to-do function to validate my request payload. And the validate create-to-do function validates against the create-to-do validation schema, which looks like this. The schema expects the title property of my schema to be a type of string. And currently the category ID is set as a string, which is incorrect, because this should be a type of Object ID. If I open up my validate create-to-do function next to my schema, we can see that the function is currently throwing an error, because category ID in the create-to-do interface is set to a type of Object ID, and the schema is expecting a string for category ID. Zod doesn't have a built-in type for a Mongoose Object ID. It only has built-in types like string, boolean, number, and so forth. So what I can do is to say that category ID should be an instance of the Mongoose Object ID type. Now the validate create-to-do function is no longer complaining. I'll start up Express server and open up Postman. Then I'll create a post request to my to-dos endpoint, and let's see what happens. We got an invalid request with an error saying input not an instance of an Object ID. And that's because category ID has a string value in our post request payload, but the schema expects an instance of the Object ID class. Let me show you how that works. I'll write a unit test which will check that an Object ID is an instance of the types.objectId class. In a new unit test file, I'll import types from Mongoose, and then I'll describe the unit test, which is an Object ID type should be an instance of types.objectId. Then I'll create an Object ID string, and then I'll write an assertion to check that the Object ID string is an instance of the types.objectId class. And the test passes. So what this last unit test simulates is a payload being posted to the API via post request. And in the payload, the category is a string. It's not an instance of the types.objectId class. And that's why the validation is failing. So how can we use Zod to validate that category ID, which is a string in our payload, is a valid Object ID? Well, we can write a custom validation function. So instead of using instance of, I'll write a custom function which I'll call validate Object ID. So I'll import Zod and give the function a name. Then I'll use the z.custom method and I'll pass in types.objectId as a type argument. Then the validation function takes a value which I'll call val, and I'll pass it to the isValidObjectId function, which doesn't exist yet, but we'll create it after this. And then finally I'll specify a message to display if the validation fails. Now I'll create a new file called isValidObjectId.ts, and then I'll create the function. The function accepts an argument called ObjectId, which I'll make a type of unknown since the validateObjectId passes a type of unknown. And finally, I'll return a boolean. The first thing I'll do is to use the built-in Mongoose function to check if an Object ID is valid. and if it is valid, I'll return true. I'll also import mongoose. Then I'll first convert the object ID to a string and pass object ID string to the isValid function. And finally, I'll return false if it's not a valid object ID. Easy. Now let's create a unit test for this function to see if everything works as expected, because there's a slight problem with the mongoose isValid function. Let me show you. I'll create a new unit test file, and then I'll create a describe block for my test and call it isValid object ID. Then I'll create the unit test and give it a description. Should return true for a valid string, because if it's a valid Mongo ID string, we'd like to return true. Then I'll create an object ID and set it to a mongoose object ID. Then I'll create a string from that object ID. And finally, I'll assert that the object ID string is a valid object ID. Everything is green. So far, so good. I'll create another test and name it should return false for input that is a number. And then I'll write an assertion to make sure it returns false if I pass in 1, 2, 3. And then I'll create another test called should return false for a string that is 12 characters long. I'll create a 12 character string, and then I'll assert that isValid object ID returns false. And now the test fails. The default behavior of Mongoose's built-in isValid function returns true if we pass in a 12-digit number, and that would clearly not be a valid object ID. So to fix this, I'm first going to assure that I immediately return false if we receive an object ID that is not a string. And then, if the length of the string is not 24 characters, I'll also return false. And now the test passes. Finally, I'll write a test to make sure that if a string that is 24 characters long is received, but it contains invalid characters, I'll also return false. I'll create a string with 24 invalid characters, and then I'll assert that the isValid object ID returns false. Now that the tests are passing, all that's left to do is to make sure that the schema is using the validate object ID function. So I'll simply import it. It's complaining for some reason, and the reason is that in the validate object ID function, I never return the result. So I'll simply remove the curly braces for an implicit return. Now that all the errors are gone on the validation schema, I'll go back to Postman to see if the validation works as expected now. And now we get a 201 response as expected. Now that we have a validation function that checks if an object ID is a valid object ID, let's look at the second use case, where we can check that an object ID exists. Currently, the validation function only checks if the category ID conforms to the object ID specification. It doesn't check that the category ID exists in the category collection. To do that, I'll show you how you can use Async Validation and Zod to perform such a validation check. I'll create a new file called validateCategoryExists.ts. Then I'll create the skeleton function and import Zod. I'll use the z.custom function method again, and I'll pass in types.objectId as a type argument, but this time I'll use the fluent method called refine. The refine method will receive a value which I'll call val, and then I'll make it async, and I'll specify a message to display if the validation fails. Then I'll get the category from Mongo, and I'll pass in the val. Then I'll return a truthy, which is to say that if there's a value, return true, otherwise return false. And finally, I'll import types from Mongoose. Now I can go back to the schema, and to test this function, instead of calling the validate object ID function, I'll change this to validate category exists. Then, since the validate category exists function is an async function, I'll go back to the validate createTo function, and then instead of using the safePass method, I'll use the safePass async method. I'll also wrap the return in a promise. After rebuilding, it seems I'm getting an error because I forgot to add an await in my createTo function. So I'll just update the createTo function to use await when calling the validate createTo function, since that function is now async. Now I'll go back to Postman, where I'll enter a unique title, and since I'm still using a category ID which does not exist, I should now see a validation error. And since we are no longer calling the validate object ID function, if I use a value that is not a valid object ID, I'm expecting to get a Mongo error instead of a validation error. What I'll do now is to try and call both the validate object ID and validate category exists functions in the schema. So I'll use Zod's AND method to chain both methods together. Let's go over to Postman again and see if everything works. So if I send another post request with an invalid category ID, I should see a validation error instead of a Mongo error, but we're still getting a Mongo error. Let's see what happens if I use a valid object ID, but a category ID that doesn't exist. So it seems that only the validate category exists validation works and not the validate object ID validation. And the reason for this is that in Zod, the AND method works like an intersection type instead of how you would expect a typical AND method to work. And so it will only return the last error message. In my opinion, this is a bad implementation in Zod. AND doesn't work like you'd expect AND to work. There's already an intersection method. Why didn't they use the existing intersection method for an intersection method and let the AND method behave like it should? But I digress. To fix this, I'll rename the validate category exists function to validate category because this function will validate both conditions. Next, I'll change the refine method to SuperRefine because SuperRefine allows us to perform multiple validations. Then I'll also add context to the list of parameters that the SuperRefine method returns and remove the message object at the bottom. So what this method will do is to first validate if it's a valid object ID and then validate that the category exists. For the object ID validation, if it's not a valid object ID, I'll add an issue with a custom code and a message saying not a valid object ID. And for the category validation, if the category doesn't exist, I'll add an issue with a message saying that the category doesn't exist. Finally, I'll rename the file name to reflect the new name of the function. Now, back in the schema, instead of using the AND method and calling both functions, I'll only call the validate category function. Then I'll make sure there's no errors and head back to Postman. First, I'll enter an invalid object ID. And we should now get a validation error, but we still get an error. The reason for that is in the validate category method, I forgot to add a return statement after the first validation. So I'll just add a return statement. Back in Postman again, I'll send a post request with an invalid object ID again. And now we're getting a validation error with a message of not a valid object ID. And if I use the category ID that doesn't exist, we get a validation error with a message that says category doesn't exist. And if I use a category ID that exists, we get a 201 created. So everything is working as expected. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, please subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.